welcome to the first of our two learning events, the first one this year. We're going to learn a lot about the Main Street research project that we've commissioned, and we're going to share thoughts on its findings and on the development. Projects focused on partnership working, what makes a safe community, championing experiences of community safety. I'm getting some feedback. I'm just going to carry on in the hope that it helps out. Final reports based on reviews, gaps through our research questionnaire, focus groups and consultation, rapid literature reviews for the planning, and some research that we've already done that informs some of the project. So these events and this work should allow community safety professionals to learn and share as part of an ongoing process. So we've been having regular check-ins with David and Margaret from Main Street, and I think it's fair to say they've enjoyed this piece as much as we have. I think it's been absolutely fascinating understanding the ins and outs of community safety in such depth. So I'm not going to say too much because the team will cover all the key points, but just some things that particularly struck me. And I think the first thing is, was there ever a more crucial time for community safety partnerships to be taken centre stage? As I'm talking, it feels like we're coming out of a COVID nightmare. Most of us surviving, but some of us not. It's been horrific. Community safety partnerships have had many challenges, from policing restrictions to galvanising communities to keep themselves safe, fed and resilient. We're going to be working hard with CSPs over the next wee while to plan post-COVID strategies, and I'm really hoping that this piece of work will help. It's not all about COVID though. We've seen huge increases in things like antisocial behaviour, violence against women, mental health issues, contributing to neighbourhood disputes, family breakdowns. These things have always been with us and they will continue, I'm sad to say. So it's really important that we get it right and we focus on the right things. We need to listen to what our communities and individuals are telling us. We need to understand fears and respond with compassion and practical steps. So please enjoy this session and let us know how you've used this work to influence your policy and practice. It's really important. You're really important. We're really important. And I think this is the time now to be really raising our head above the parapet and making the difference that we know we can. So I'm going to hand over to David and put myself on mute because you can hear my dog in the background.
Thanks, Lorraine. Maybe your dog will make more sense than me. So you never know. Thanks, everybody. And what a great turnout. It's really good to see so many people turning up for this. I'm really grateful for that. As Lorraine said, I'm David Welsh. I'm from Main Street Consulting. I'm joined today by my colleague, Margaret. As you know, we were asked back in January to do some research for SCSN, and we'll present some of those elements today as part of this exercise. Now, Dawn, I think, is going to share her screen, so there's some slides that we can take you through, and that's got the additional benefit of not having to see my face too much for the next few minutes. So there we go. That's great. As Lorraine said, there's a lot to get through today, and the next slide, which Dawn will flick on to now, shows that we've got effectively 4 projects to talk through, and we'll set that out there. We've only got an hour and a bit, I think, so and we really don't want this to be a presentation from us as such. We'd rather there's a bit of a conversation as part of that session. So we'll endeavour to be as brief as possible. But I've said to Lorraine very clearly, if we drone on too long, she's got to cut it short and make sure there's time enough for conversation. Instead of giving you lots of things, what we'll do is we'll direct to the documents that we've put together, and you can read some of the detail there. There's a summary report that we've developed this week, which will be issued at some point over the next few days, and then there's the individual reports for these projects, and there's a lot in those that hopefully you'll be able to read and ask questions about. The documents themselves will detail the approach that we took to this work, and there was a lot of that over the last 12 weeks. It will set out how we approached an academic and literature review. There's lots of surveys we did with some pretty decent response rates. We facilitated and ran some focus groups, and some of those focus groups have even been continuing this week. So there's been some work done by Victim Support Scotland to support some of this as well. So some of this is actually ongoing rather than completed. At the outset, Lorraine did say to you all that that Margaret and I have really enjoyed this piece of work, and that's true. And it's true, I think, for a few reasons. Personally, I can't really remember a project that I've done through which I learned so much in such a short period of time. We'll touch on that later, no doubt, but for me, the breadth and depth of what actually constitutes community safety, I think is massively underappreciated, and we'll touch on that at some point. It was also, as you'll see on slide 3, which Don will flick onto, maybe a unique time to carry out work like this. So not only were we doing this, as Lorraine said, in the shadow of COVID and the respective lockdowns, which themselves I think contributed, or an impact on community safety in its widest sense. But we're doing it at a time when women's safety particularly was quite a big factor, prompted by the murder of Sarah Everard in London in early March. There were more Black Lives Matters protests, and that influenced some of the conversation as well. There was a bit of controversy recently about comments and attitudes towards Gypsy travellers and Roma communities by some politicians recently. And then just last week, or certainly over the last couple of weeks, there's been some comments from senior policemen across the UK about the use of police budgets on community safety. So I think all of that is an interesting mix in which to do this kind of work. And I think finally, in terms of why we've enjoyed it, genuinely, Margaret and I have been blown away by the contributions made by colleagues across the sector. Genuinely quite an inspiring bunch of people to work with. Quite can-do most of the time, pretty upbeat, really energetic and showing lots of initiative. And I'd want to thank them for their support and their contributions and willingness to give us a lot of their time when they were under other pressures. So I'm really grateful for that. Anyway, as I said, enough droning on from me. Margaret's now going to talk briefly about the first couple of those projects, after which we'll open up for a bit of discussion around those things. Is that okay? Margaret, over to you.
Thank you, David. So yeah, as David said, we were undertaking 4 projects. I'm starting with 1 and 2 here, and the first slide is just one response from our survey, looking at something that compares over a period of 10 years. And I probably don't need to tell you that the last 10 years have been a period of change in many respects. And we did have some specific reference points within that time frame as we started this research to guide us in relation to the brief. As you probably know, the network did some research on partnership working in 2012, 13 and 14, but hadn't focused specifically on partnerships since then. You'll probably also be aware of the network's recent work to consider the changing landscape of community safety and to develop a community safety narrative. So this research has been designed to bring those 2 strands of work together and also take account of the many changes in the operating environment, such as, obviously, as Lorraine says, the COVID-19 pandemic, the general increased awareness of safety for women, Black Lives Matters, these things that David was pointing to. Looking specifically at partnership, first of all, we asked the question you can see here about partnership working in the last 10 years and got a quite clear answer. As you can see, there's been a growth in the range of partners, presumably at the same time as people have been experiencing the impact of austerity. We've also seen the advent of Police Scotland, Scottish Fire and Rescue Service, the Community Empowerment Act, Community Justice Scotland, etc., which may mean that that has created a change to who we have to partner with and why. So overall, I think it's fair to say a significant change, period of change for community safety in Scotland these last 10 years. Can I just get the next slide, please? So we were asking a question here: what are the components of a modern and effective community safety partnership? And it's quite clear to everyone that there's not a one-size-fits-all CSP model. We don't have that statutory status that they have in England and Wales, but nonetheless, we found it useful to explore with CSP leads some of the ways in which you can begin to identify the common issues that many face, the type of partnerships formed, whether formal or informal, and components that a modern and effective partnership could find useful to consider going forward. So firstly, their complexity. It's a word that applies, I think, to both the operating environment and to the community safety response. We also found through discussion in the focus groups that complexity can be seen as both a challenge and an opportunity, and that there are different types of complexity in rural, urban and specific local areas. Approach. Some of the things that we have explored under this heading when looking to describe the components of a modern and effective CSP include being asset-based, dealing with cross-cutting issues such as loneliness and isolation, health and well-being, tackling inequalities, that balance of being reactive and proactive, etc. On relationships, clearly relationships are at the heart of good partnership working within and across partner organisations, and also within communities themselves, with communities themselves. The word partnership was important, but we also heard about the importance of collaborating and of co-designing joint ventures. On capacity, this was about how resources are harnessed and targeted, and also the human resource side, being agile, flexible, multi-skilled and inventive. And this is one of the important findings for us, as David says, that this community safety leads we met with very much demonstrated these qualities. So moving forward, we could see further potential for modern and effective partnership working clustered around some of these key words, which I'll quickly tease out. Engagement. We read a lot through the literature review about community engagement and also community empowerment, which is being proposed as best practice. What case studies are showing suggests that there is success or otherwise to varying degrees of community engagement empowerment strategies. And also we were encountering terms such as community resilience, the co-production of services, community-led practice, person-centered practice, and people having agency was important. So we were looking at a lot of this literature, which is often about the wider public and voluntary sector working in partnership with communities, engaging communities. And then through our focus group discussions, we encountered some examples of community safety initiatives working well in this field, but also I think a recognition that engaging with communities and empowering people had a lot more potential, which is certainly what the literature area was suggesting. So strategy, you'll see when we come to this, a later slide with showing some of the results from our survey, that strategic planning skills are seen as a strength by the majority. Also under the strategy heading, we've identified the importance of strategic issues such as early intervention and prevention, which was noted by some as requiring a bit of a refresh, not just for community safety, of course, but for the wider public sector. But there's a general recognition that the principles are strategically important. And now we're 10 years on from the Christie Commission report. This is not yet as embedded in practice as it might be. More successful has been the adoption of an outcomes approach, which was mentioned positively by a number of participants in the focus groups. However, 8 respondents to the survey that we issued said that they had low confidence, and 1 reported no confidence in an outcomes-based approach. So quite probably it's a mixed picture across Scotland with further potential there too. Then on collaboration, approaches to collaboration with partners and with communities was also an area we felt to have further potential. We see that growth in the range of partners people are working with, and there may be more potential to maximise this by thinking about how partners collaborate, where the best experience of that is, and how the sharing of what we have called best thinking, not just sharing of best practice, through a process of joint reflection, action learning, etc., may be really helpful. And finally, on this slide, there is evidence, which David will speak about shortly, more potential there. Next slide, if I may, please. So just a quick slide from the survey results, and I hope you may be able to read some of this. This was a question about the skills currently available to community safety partnerships. And as you will see, there are quite a number of skills that are reported as not being in place for 50% or more of the respondents. We could call these skills gaps, and that is probably what they are, but we were also, through this part of the research, exploring a more general question: what skills are needed for a modern and effective CSP? Can I just get the next slide, please? We had a particular question about some quite specific skills supporting the engagement capability of CSPs. And as you can see, we asked about deliberative, consultative, participative and facilitation skills, providing a brief definition of each, which you can see there. And now we asked about this partly because there is understood to be much more potential around these type of skills for public servants and others seeking to work in partnership with communities. And you'll see what we have is a reporting of an absence of these skills for some CSPs on deliberative skills and to some extent also participative skills. Perhaps that suggests that people are very experienced and comfortable when it comes to consulting folk, but less so for co-production and other aspects of what we might call deep community engagement. And I just get the next slide, please. So further potential again identified here around these three headings. Just on that last one, learning and development, we could see a lot of further potential for people getting together to share and learn. This was prompted by our experience of the focus groups as well as the literature on this topic. We felt that the appetite for the conversations we were having was strong and the opportunity to continue sharing and learning would be welcomed. And of course, feel free to come back on that point today if you have any particular thoughts on that. Next slide, please. So project 2, I'm now going to focus on, which had a title of What Makes a Safe Community. And one of the things we explored here was perceptions of safety, which we defined as felt to be safe, seen to be safe, and understood to be safe, as captured in this diagram. The difference between being and feeling safe was something that was reflected upon by the participants in the focus groups and also in the discussions with community groups for Project 4. Next slide, please. On this slide, we have what are essentially some very brief answers to the question, what makes a safe community? You may want to make a note here and come back to us in the discussion about this very simple snapshot answer to the question. Much more is written, of course, in the full research report. Just one of the words here I'll highlight, though, is digital. I would say that we touched upon digital through our research and started to uncover some thinking through the focus group discussions. It wasn't, I have to say, a particular feature of our literature review, but online safety and how to make sense of it, empower people through digital, help people to stay safe from harm, etc., is very much a live issue and one that needs to be thought about further, I think. Next slide, please. Yes, difficult to read. I think hopefully you can read some of those blue boxes. We've created this systems map to present some of the complexity I've spoken about and to identify where there may be levers in the system. So the blue boxes are noted as characteristics, variables. You may have some thoughts on how they contribute to the achievement of a safe community. Perhaps they can better operate, some of them, for example, as levers for change. So that's project 1A and 1B and project 2. And I look forward to hearing your thoughts on this through our discussion. And I've got a note to hand over to David, but actually perhaps it's handing over to Lorraine, David, for chairing the discussion. Thanks.
That map's terrifying. What's to think about? I'm having some feedback, so I'm wondering if that's better. Okay, I'm interested in what you guys think about that. We've covered projects 1 and 2. We've got a bit more to cover, but let's have a little break and have a chat around it. So does anybody want to come in and tell us what you think, or ask David or Margaret some questions? No, that can't be right. No one? Okay.
Is it worth me, Lorraine, just giving a little bit more context around the systems map? Would that be helpful? I appreciate, as Margaret said, that colleagues might not be able to read the detail there. But for us, that was one of the most interesting things to do. It was one of the most difficult things to do, actually, as part of this exercise, even though it was a fairly small deliverable for colleagues at the network. But we spent a long time trying to pull that together. And from our side, it was really, it was quite instructive, I would say. You know, it echoes back to that point I made earlier around, you know, being surprised about the breadth and depth of activity that's involved in community safety across Scotland. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that I was surprised by that as part of the work, because, you know, if you look at it on that map, or you look at it as in any element of the literature review that Margaret did, it's not far off everything that public services and community services and civic society in Scotland actually does. You know, that it covers a huge spectrum of activity across Scotland, and that in itself was quite instructive. So we tried to pull that together into that one map. And that was difficult to do on one page, which is why it's quite convoluted. But in itself, I think that's interesting, because it does show just how complex this actually is. You know, this map, if nothing else, shows you that community safety in Scotland is absolutely a complex area. I think it should also show, though, that the influences in the system, if we look at the system as a whole, are a combination of, you know, hyper local, regional and national. So those kind of levers that we pull to make communities safe exist in a whole lot of areas across Scotland. It's not just for local communities or community safety partnerships or big national agencies like the police. There's a lot of policy implications here, and certainly one of the conversations that Lorraine and Josh and Dawn and Sandra and others have been having with us as part of this exercise is looking at the influence of poverty, for example, on safety, and whether the levers that we can pull to increase that kind of resilience in areas and therefore make them more safe. So there's an issue there about as well as complexity. There's an issue there about the influences and how we pull those levers. And I think it also shows that to make anything safe in a community, that there are multiple stakeholders have to be involved in this. We shied away from naming individuals or agencies in this map because we didn't think that would be helpful. It would make it more complicated. But what we wanted to demonstrate was there are lots and lots of activities that are done by community safety partnerships, local authorities, the health sector, the ambulance service, Neighbourhood Watch, DWP, whoever that might be, local authorities. They're all involved in this kind of stuff to a greater or lesser extent, and doing it in partnership. So the point really there was to make that point about numbers of stakeholders being involved in influencing the purple boxes, which then in turn influence the blue boxes, which then in turn influence what a safe community actually might be. The final thing I'll say on that, because I'm now droning on, I apologise for that, is one of the things that we debated at length was where online safety fits into this. And, you know, there were iterations of this map where online safety was actually one of the blue boxes, and perhaps that gave it more prominence than was necessary. But perhaps there's a part of the conversation today around where online safety exists. It does actually, it's on the map on the left hand side, but maybe there's a conversation around where that fits into this whole thing. Apologies, Lorraine. That was supposed to be a minute. I spoke for 5, so apologies.
A couple of things in the chat box. Billy, are you there? Billy Mycock has noted the link to anti-bullying to antisocial behaviour and is suggesting we might take that as an example and work through what that might mean. And Karen Moyer is asking, where are the links in this to community justice? Both good observations and good questions. In terms of community justice, I think community justice, you know, is part of the system. As I said, it's not. We didn't want to name individual agencies because that would have made it more complicated, and also perhaps moved us away from this issue about it being, you know, partnership and multiple stakeholders and influences and all those kind of things. But definitely we're there, and some of you may know that Hannah Dixon, who started doing this work with us, has now moved into working with Community Justice Scotland, for example. So there's definitely links there as we take this forward. In terms of Billy's comment around anti-bullying and you know, the links there. Does Billy want to expand on that, and he himself could maybe influence how this could maybe be done differently, or a new iteration developed? Is that unfair to ask Billy to do that, or is he there to make a comment? I don't know, Billy, are you there? Do you want to come in at this point? So he's either not there or not wanting to come in.
That's all right. It's not a problem. I think that the point is well made. That anti-bullying should be there, and you know, it is related, I think, to a number of agendas. Certainly on that left-hand side of the systems map, and we want to maybe strengthen that if that's a particular agenda where Billy is. I think Billy's in Shetland. Is that right? So yeah, we could are happy to have a further conversation with Billy about bringing that out and giving it more prominence if that's appropriate.
I mean, I think antisocial behaviour is a really good pull out. I think there is. I think there's further work that we're doing and will continue to do, just looking at antisocial behaviour. Very conscious that, you know, we talk an awful lot about needing to rethink our strategy, needing to rethink what antisocial behaviour means. So watch this space. We'll be working on that, and we'll be doing some more on that. Does anybody else want to come in? Okay, someone is saying it's very difficult. Pauline, do you want to come in? So,
sure, yeah. I'm finding it really, I can't make out most of the pink boxes, but I can read the blue ones. So I was interested in the evidence blue box and the cohesion one. But I can't read the pink boxes feeding into the cohesion one in particular. So I just wondered if you can maybe say a few things about it, because I feel that's where the intersection with hate crime, work to address hate crime, maybe is most relevant. Certainly relevant everywhere.
Yeah, thanks, Pauline. That's fair. And on the wider point about the accessibility or you know, visibility of that map, you'll get a copy of this, I think, over the next few days. We'll be able to, you know, blow that up and read some of the underpinning purple boxes there. In terms of cohesion, there are lots of things filling, you know, adding to that. So as I look at it on my screen, there's bits around diversity awareness, hate crime reporting, faith groups and their influence on that, diversity events, knowing your neighbours, community pride, civic duty, a whole range of things feeding into cohesion. In terms of evidence, there was a lot of the evidence material on the systems map came from Project 3, which I'll touch on in a few seconds. But the things that are inputting into that on the slide are around ease of reporting, accurate data, data gathering across local authorities and partnerships. There's a bit there moving on to a slightly different agenda around countering misinformation, which was something that came up a few times. And again, I said a few things a minute ago about online safety. So there was quite a few stories and a few observations made by colleagues as we did the focus groups around online safety, scams, fraud, and, you know, harnessing and gathering evidence to counter that kind of stuff as well. So quite a lot of things actually fed into that evidence blue box, as indeed is the case for the whole map. It's you know, obviously complex, but it's complex because the work that you guys do is complex and you know, is massively interrelated and interdependent on lots of different things going on there. So as I say, you'll see a version of this in due course where you can start to unpick that and hopefully see the things that feed into the blue boxes at least.
Thanks. Thank you.
Right. No worries. Thanks, Pauline.
We've got another couple of minutes if there's anything else anyone has for David on projects 1 and 2. If not, I think
Lorraine, I think someone's got their hand up, I think.
Okay, I can't see that.
Hi, Lorraine, it's Yvonne. Can I just
Yvonne.
make a comment? Hiya. It's not really for this map, but a really good comment, and I completely would agree with it, was the one about some skills lacking, I think, certainly on I'd say for myself, with regards to the deliberative, facilitation, consultative and participative engagement tools. Now, I think for me, I'm not online, I'm not within the communities, and I'm not actually, unless I do any particular work, but generally that's where that consultative with other partners comes in. And I rely a lot on other partners to do that work and then feed that back. So I would wholly agree with that point. And I think when we're perhaps looking to make changes and do more collaborative work with communities, I think that's going to be quite a crucial part for some of us.
Yeah, Absolutely. David, Margaret, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I'm trying to get unmuted here. Oh, yeah. Yeah, can I just come in and yes, I think one thing I'm also interested to hear from people on is, you know, we're all used to doing training to acquire skills, but I think also we found that the process of, you know, those focus group discussions were really discursive, really, you know, there was a lot of interesting knocking around of what we've called best thinking. You know, there was and we feel there's a lot more potential in, yes, there are skills gaps and there can be training for that, but also just collaborating on thinking in order to progress, not just hearing about best practice, but developing ideas, that kind of learning, action learning, all that kind of collaborative learning. Is that something that would be interesting to people?
Yvonne, you still have your hand up. Do you want to come back in?
Sorry. Yeah, I think you're right, but I think it's more than that. I think it's more how we do that joint work, whether it's with other departments within our own service structures or whether it's with other services, because no matter how much learning I've got on different types of collaboration with the public, I'm not necessarily the one that's going to be out there delivering or doing that, and I'm still relying on others. So it's how we help facilitate that piece of work within the communities in order to make that happen from where we're based, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, I think, David, if you're ready, we can move on.
Yeah, but Billy's got his hand up, though. I'm keen to hear from Billy.
Right, okay, sorry. I'm the rubbish facilitator.
No, it's fine. I just put it up as you said that. Sorry, I caught you out. What the quick point I was going to make, and I don't know if it's an initiative that's done more widely, but there's an initiative called Safer Highlander,
Right.
which goes into schools at around S1 age and pulls together a lot of different agencies like Coast Guard, Fire Brigade, Police, Hydro, all that sort of stuff, and does like short presentations to young people around safety aspects, which cover a lot of the issues that you're talking about in this diagram. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering if that's a good example of how you can work with a lot of different agencies to bring forward the community safety agenda, although that's more focused on a particular educational input.
Billy, I think we'd like to hear more about that. So can I ask Josh Box to be in touch with you?
Yeah, that's fine.
And we can maybe work that up into some sort of case study or something and send it round if people would be interested in that. That sounds great.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I'll do that.
Okay.
It's a great example, Billy, actually. And one of the things we'll touch on probably maybe too briefly when we talk about Project 4 is the use of education and schools as part of this wider agenda. Some of the individual stories we heard from protected groups were very keen that we start to do a bit of early intervention and prevention work around hate crime, for example, at school level, and you know the questions there are around the extent to which colleagues on this meeting, for example, can influence that decision. So yeah, it's a perfect case study actually, and one we'd want to highlight.
Lovely.
Great, thank you, Billy, and thanks everybody for the comments there. As I said at the outset, and I'll probably say a few more times over the course of the next half an hour, there's much more detail in the actual reports, the summary report, but then the individual reports, and you'll be able to see where a lot of this thinking came from. But you know, rest assured, a lot of this came from conversations with yourselves and your colleagues. This is all we're really doing is structuring the thinking that came from you plus the research. And so this is to some extent an echo of what you've already told us. That's great. Thank you very much for that. Project 3 then is another thing we've been looking at. And you know, Dawn's put the slide up there. Thanks very much for that. This was largely about championing evidence, but I think it's fair to say that we strayed into lots of other territory around data, information, sharing, some of the obstacles that are involved in doing that kind of thing. But the starting point for the work itself was the survey that we did. So we did a survey, we did a couple of surveys actually, but we did one back in early February, and then followed it up with a series of focus groups in early March. And in that survey, and then subsequently in the focus groups, that there were a few questions related to data and evidence-informed policy. So, for example, in the survey, when we asked how community safety issues get identified and prioritised, just under 60% of respondents believe that is informed by data. So I suppose there's a question then about the 40% of respondents who don't believe that. So there's a bit of a mixed picture there in terms of the use of data and the use of evidence to set priorities, and I think that in itself is pretty instructive. Less than half of the people who are involved in community safety partnerships believe that they've got data analysis skills and expertise available to do their work. When it comes to the development and delivery of community safety activity in local areas, 70% of respondents said that it's mostly evidence-based, but only 52% said that it's planned using qualitative data. So there's a lot of numbers and trends there, but coming back to some of the points that Margaret made, and indeed that Yvonne picked up on a few minutes ago, that kind of structured community engagement using focus groups, case studies, questionnaires, etc., aren't used enough in informing community safety plans locally. And again, that was something that a number of colleagues, as we spoke to them, suggested that needs to be looked at. And as you see on this slide, when we asked respondents about barriers and challenges to the successful delivery of plans underpinned by evidence, 90% of people referenced access to and analysis of data for community safety as a challenge, and all of them, without exception, said that information sharing was a challenge. So there's something, I think, pretty instructive there, which may not be a surprise to colleagues in this meeting, but nonetheless is a pretty powerful message. Everyone thinks that information sharing is a challenge, no matter where they are across the country. In March, I spoke to a range of people, some of whom are indeed in this meeting today, specifically about data and evidence from a community safety perspective. Those weren't just community safety partnership leads, but a number of colleagues from Police Scotland, from the Fire and Rescue Service, from community planning partnerships, from local authorities, some academics, so a range of folk about that. And our summary of those conversations about data and evidence sharing and champion evidence is essentially set out, I think, on the next slide. So Dawn, when she pushes that on, we'll be able to see some comments there. So I think the way I would characterise this is that colleagues, without exception, when I spoke to them, and as I say, there was about 15 or so one-to-one conversations we did in March, all of them really want to do more in this area, and by which I mean, use evidence and promote evidence more for community safety. So I think the prevailing view would be it's an area for development for us all. It was certainly referenced several times, for example, in the context of early intervention and prevention type stuff. But as we spoke to people and tried to tease out why they thought this was a particular challenge, there were some what I would call real or perceived obstacles in the way, and they're listed on this slide. The main one I've touched on already, and indeed Margaret touched on as part of her piece on Project 1B. The challenges are mainly in capacity and capability. There's a real sense that data analysis resource has been reduced quite significantly over the past few years, certainly in the majority of community safety partnerships and the partners themselves, and even colleagues in the police and fire and rescue service said that that's a challenge for them as well. So capacity and skills on data is something that's holding back the use of evidence and taking that forward. There's a sense also that information sharing itself has kind of stalled across CSPs and indeed between partners. So that's been an issue. Now, some of that may be because of COVID and lockdown. So over the last year, it's been increasingly difficult just to meet people, as you know, but also maybe getting access to shared systems where they're kind of locked down. And that was raised maybe 2 or 3 times as part of those conversations. But I think it's also used, or it's also an issue because of, and I really hate this word, but you know, silos. There are still silos in the sector. There are still perceived barriers between organisations and sharing data. Another issue there, perhaps a related issue, is GDPR and data protection. So it's either a source of confusion, or people are being told it stops them doing stuff, or it's being used as an excuse. And I would say that a number of colleagues that I spoke to in March and in early April were pretty sceptical about that, and that GDPR is being used as an excuse just not to do stuff. You know, it's just too hard, therefore we won't get involved in sharing evidence or analysing data together. And I think there's an issue there that we need to address, I think, as a sector, about what we do on GDPR, just to dispel some of those myths, and that may be a reasonably quick win. Another point that was made, interestingly, by 3 or 4 community safety partnership leads is around genuine interest in data. And by that they meant, I think, largely elected politicians or, you know, very senior staff who don't really see the value of community safety data in its widest sense. You know, it's not a priority, or it's not sexy enough. If we present information on fly tipping or antisocial behaviour or graffiti, that's great, because these are problems that elected politicians have on their desk, or senior officers on their desk, but not the wider set of data. So there's something there about just getting people interested in this and making it a bit more pointed and sexy and interesting for them, I think. So that was raised a couple of times. And then there's some issues around the increased use of social media monitoring and citizen data. So actually using data produced by citizens themselves to inform, you know, trends and forecasting and all those kind of things. And there are some examples across Scotland of that being done. Certainly colleagues from Glasgow spoke about it, Scottish Border spoke about it, Fife spoke about it, and I'm sure there are others across Scotland who are now kind of monitoring social media for potential antisocial behaviour, for example, but also other things that could perhaps be used in a preventative way. The next slide talks about a few good or different examples of where evidence is being used well across Scotland. Now, we've got loads of them, and I pulled out totally at random 8 or so that were referenced as part of the work that we're doing. So you'll see a few examples there. There was one around naloxone rollout in Glasgow, which is an interesting initiative in its own right. But a lot of that was based on local authority, health, and Scottish and police and Scottish Ambulance Service work being done together. So marrying up different data sets there around prevalence of potential overdoses, but also Scottish Ambulance Service response times, and therefore police officers or other officials being given naloxone to use in certain areas. So there's something interesting about that. In the Western Isles, one of your colleagues there, Frank, referenced the water safety plans they're doing and rollout of smart signs, which was driven by data analysis by the local authority, other community partners, including the Coast Guard and RNLI, for example. So lots of good stuff being there. City of Edinburgh's work with Scottish Ambulance Service on antisocial behaviour prevention challenges, etc., etc. So there's lots of stuff going on in Scotland that we'd want to, I think, highlight more and share more across the sector, and perhaps see where we can learn from one another. The important point for me, though, is not so much these examples, but I think the approach that underpins all of them, which is that priorities are identified locally, data analysis has been done and shared and worked up together, and then implemented by a range of partners locally. So there's something quite interesting, I think, about all of those things that underpins the good practice. The final points, I think, on the next slide, Dawn, are around the implications, I think, for evidence, data, information sharing. So we'll set out a few sort of suggestions in the report itself, which you'll no doubt see in due course. But largely, these are things that perhaps we can do together to develop and help colleagues with this particular agenda. So by that I mean SCSN itself, but also in conjunction with national agencies and with community safety partnerships themselves. So some of them is just about improving awareness and the accessibility of what data is actually available locally and able to be shared. That there is something about data sharing protocols, and I do wonder whether Lorraine and colleagues could maybe look at the GDPR issue again and maybe dispel some of those myths once and for all, that actually this isn't an inhibitor and we shouldn't be using that as an excuse for not sharing stuff. There is a bit around capacity and capability on data. So looking at that in terms of skills, first of all. So, you know, what do we need locally and centrally on community safety data, but perhaps potentially looking at sharing resource around that to you know, access data, transform it and manipulate it into trends and forecasting and use more generally. And then there's a few other bits and pieces there around, you know, potentially pulling that resource, encouraging better engagement with it, and so on. So there's some things there, I think, to be looking at on the overall evidence piece. But from my side, I think that's probably enough of my drivel. I think there's enough there, I think, for people to be thinking about. Even if it's as prosaic as around GDPR or access to data analysis. And I've seen there's a few comments coming through already to that effect. So over to you. If colleagues have got comments on that, that would be really well received. I'm looking forward to that.
Okay, so lots of stuff in the comment boxes. I think I can give you a commitment that we will be looking further at some of the suggestions and the recommendations. That will be a work stream that we'll take on. I was going to say at the end that we have appointed a new senior national development officer, and that person will start in June. So we will have increased capacity to do some of that stuff. Some of the people who have put things in the comments, do you want to come in and talk about some of your comments or ask them for some specific responses? Or does anyone else want to come in with anything? We've got about 10 minutes for chat about this project before we move on. I don't see any hands up. Yeah, Pauline, do you want to come back in?
Yeah, I made a comment about Dave's suggestions about the team developing some guidance and looking at data sharing protocols nationally. I think it's an excellent idea. Hopefully it would help colleagues in Police Scotland as well to establish a common approach across the country to data sharing, because certainly one of the things that we've found is that since the advent of Police Scotland, which, as you know, wasn't yesterday, the kind of local data sharing arrangements we had in place, we've never gotten back to that same level of information sharing, and local police representatives feeling that their hands are tied, that they have to take instruction from the centre. But the local partners not having the relationship with the centre to address that. So I think the Community Safety Network nationally could potentially have a role in looking at establishing a common agreement with Police Scotland for community safety partners locally. So I would really welcome that. I think it's a great idea. Okay,
and yeah, we'll look at that. I'm going to bring Derek in and then Billy before I come back to David and Margaret for responses. So Derek, do you want to come in?
Hi there. It's just to highlight a lot of the points that, I mean, I totally agree with the data sharing to keep us all informed of what's happening, but at local levels, this is not actually happening. You know, I mean, I can ask my local Bobby, is the CCTV working at Boyfield Gardens, sort of thing? Well, I don't know. We don't have that information. You know, these are daft things. You know, when the police come to our community council meetings and they give us a report of what's been happening, sort of thing, when you throw things like, well, is the council going to be helping you with these sort of things? And, well, no, we don't correspond with them regarding these things. One of the poorest things that's happened just recently is they changed the lighting from soda to LEDs, and they're so inefficient. Yes, they're maybe 1/10 of the price to run, but that's what the council look at. They're not looking at the safety aspects of the areas. Especially around my area, we have quite a lot of amenity housing and old folks sheltered accommodations. And when you change to LED lighting, they can't see beyond the lamppost. You know, so there's a lack here, you know, and this has to be brought together somehow to form this new safety aspect. It's really quite, I mean, I can go on for ages about different things, but, you know, that's just a couple of wee pointers sort of thing that's happening on the ground in front of us.
Okay, Derek, your point is well made, and as we've been looking at particular perceptions of community safety by people with protected characteristics, we've discovered a whole range of stuff like that. So where someone might feel safe with an arrangement, someone else might not, and it's important to understand that. Billy, do you want to come in?
Yeah, sorry, it just takes a minute to unmute the microphone. Yeah, I mean, basically what I was going to say is very similar to what Derek has just said, and it's just there's a lot of barriers for information sharing that just basically make no sense, but it seems to have been all around data sharing and, you know, what information do we have a right to share, etc., etc. But like when you're sharing it for the benefit of someone, then you would think that would be a lot easier to do. And it's not just between agencies, but even within services, within councils and stuff, it is very difficult or even risky to, you know, in some ways to be sharing that information when it shouldn't be. So I think that is definitely something that needs to be looked at thoroughly across the whole of Scotland.
Okay, very quickly before I ask David and Margaret to comment on those things, Liz Lumsden has made what I think is a brilliant point around basic public health. Liz, do you want to come in and talk about this, or are you happy just to leave it as a comment?
I suppose really just as a comment, and I think it's been brought up quite a few times in the past that people do need a bit more training on public health, but what David was talking about there underpinning everything, it is just basic public health principles. You identify what the issue is, you look at the research, you identify what works, you implement it, and so it goes on, but we just need, I think, a lot of practitioners maybe need a wee bit more training and information on that.
Okay,
thanks.
David and Margaret, quite a lot there.
There is, yeah, but gratifying to hear that colleagues agree with some of those at least outline recommendations around data sharing protocols. That was an issue. I'm pleased to hear that colleagues still think that's something to be looked at. And Lorraine, there's maybe a role for the network to help out with that kind of stuff. I suppose the other thing I was expecting perhaps was more commentary from colleagues on data analysis resource. It did come up a number of times in the conversations. Without any exception, I think every partnership, every partner thought we don't have enough access to this kind of skill and this kind of capacity. People are nodding, I see on the screen here, but is that the case? That there's no getting away from that's something that ought to be looked at. That's pleasing to hear. Good.
David, on that, I think SCSN have been concerned about that for a long time. I think we've seen the diminishment of analytical capacity at community safety and indeed community planning partnership level for a long time. And colleagues will be familiar that we did run the Partnership Analyst Forum and we've stopped and for a few reasons. One, because there just weren't that many partnership analysts to make a forum. And we also wanted to extend the invitation to the analysts that are there to participate in other types of forums and networks that we run. So, but that's a work in progress. I mean, you've made some recommendations on that, but I think it's a critical concern for community safety partnerships that we are reducing an analytical capacity, and I think we might want to shout a little bit more about that. So we'll watch this space. We'll come back to that.
That's good to hear. In the report that colleagues will see, I think in due course, that there is some anecdotal commentary in there, I think from colleagues at the police, but also a few others who said that in 2014-15 there was maybe 19 of the partnerships had dedicated resource, and that's now down to about 11 or 12. So even in the last few years, that's halved again. So if that's the anecdotal evidence, if that's what people are saying in the surveys, it's clearly an issue to be looked at. That's good. One thing that just struck me is that Billy earlier on mentioned the Safer Highlander initiative. I think that's something we'll add into the report. Actually, that's another good example of things that people could be extolling and evangelising across the whole network. So that's helpful.
Can I just quickly just say welcome that point on basic public health principles in relation to community safety. There's a section of the Project 2 report for basic safety principles, just kind of refreshing the point about principles. So that's, it's really useful point of connection there. And also just a wee thought that popped into my head that we had as a suggestion, and I think it may have made its way into the report somewhere, that that perhaps there's a procurement issue around CCTV, that it would be ideal to be doing it at a national level, but I don't know if that's realistic, Lorraine, or something you've looked at before.
So taking a sharp intake of breath here before I say anything on this, we have, as an organisation, taken a look at CCTV across Scotland. It's a tricky, wicked issue. That's not to say that we shouldn't look at it, but I accept that people will, have views about it, and I'm happy to pick up that conversation again. So, David, do we want to move on to the next project?
Yep. If colleagues can tolerate another 10 minutes of me, then I'm happy to do so. Project 4 builds on work that the SCSN did last year. So there was a report from July 2020. Who can remember that far back, on perceptions and experiences of community safety? I think that was the title. And then there was a follow-up webinar just before Christmas last year that discussed a lot of those findings. And that work identified a number of data gaps around especially around young children, or children and young people, around trans and gender non-conforming people, LGBT communities. There was some gaps around specific minority ethnic groups in Scotland, and people with disabilities. So in short, the recommendation or the discussion, at least before Christmas, was we need to do more work with those communities, and that in turn, I think, had it kind of sparked some conversations, I think, among colleagues like Lorraine and others, around recognising community safety not just being about geographic communities, but also communities of interest. And for those communities especially, we need some sort of national activity coordination. Anyway, so the piece of work that we've been doing over the last month or so was to explore some personal experiences of those kind of groups. So groups who with protected characteristics, or who are otherwise underrepresented in the kind of work that the SCSN and others have been doing over the last few years. I should say at the outset that this bit of work wasn't set up to draw conclusions. It was just designed to capture some stories and experiences for follow-up activities by SCSN or its partners, or indeed other stakeholders. So some of that emerged from the survey and the initial focus groups we did back in March. But I'm very clear, as is Margaret, and I think colleagues are too, that further activity is needed on this. So I think what we should say is that this project is live, and there's further engagement to be carried out. And I know that Josh and Dawn, for example, are keen to keep doing that over the course of the next few months. But by definition, I think the approach to this project was different from other elements. So we had to recognise that these groups and individuals that we wanted to engage with are underrepresented typically. So in the research we do, so there were some additional sensitivities around engagement. So that meant, for example, that we worked closely with a bunch of relevant voluntary sector groups to identify people to participate in the survey and indeed in the focus groups. We did a separate, pretty light touch questionnaire survey for use, which had very specific accessibility requirements for the consultees. So, for example, one of the groups we spoke to was convened by Sight Scotland, who look after blind and visually impaired people. So that meant that the survey had to be, adapted for their needs. So we did that, as well as just looking at, very plain English and those other kind of things. So again, a learning experience for me, but hopefully also for SCSN and others. We then ran a series of follow-up workshop sessions or one-to-one conversations with people from these groups, and that again, interestingly, included suggestions that someone from the community itself ran the session and not me or Margaret or someone from the network. That the session could be done anonymously or otherwise. That cameras, if we were doing a Zoom call or Teams meeting, could be turned off. That no recorded need be made. And in fact, that as was the case with one of the workshops, that it was run autonomously, so we weren't involved in it at all, other than requesting some themes and questions to be covered off. So I think overall that the point was that this was a different kind of approach, but it seems to have worked over the course of the last month, and I think that in itself is quite interesting, and hopefully something that SCSN can take forward as a method or a sort of an approach to do this kind of stuff in future. So that's the approach, and I think that in itself is worth just saying to you all, that was different and worthy of comment in its own right. If Dawn can move on to the next slide, I think we can talk briefly about the survey element. So as I said, a separate survey went out in mid-March, and we got, as per these slides, about 60. It's actually nearer 70 now, but we got 60 responses from a wide range of otherwise unrepresented groups, as you might be able to see from that slide. So again, if you can blow that up a little bit in your own time, you'll see that there's a big chunk of young people. Most of them, more than half, were women. There are people from gender non-conforming backgrounds, etc. So lots of different types of people there that we otherwise wouldn't have captured in the other survey. About at the bottom of that slide, you'll see that just under 10% of our respondents at this stage felt unsafe. So although quite a low number, worthy of comment, I would say. So the detailed analysis on that is yet to be done on the individual responses, but most of the people in that category of feeling unsafe appeared to be victims or witnesses to a crime. So a lot of their comments were about experiencing domestic abuse, about Police Scotland not taking reports seriously, and consequently people still feeling unsafe in their community. People talking about just being unwilling to walk on their own late at night. References to crimes that have happened to them in the past. Some comments about, as an this is an example, as an ethnic woman, I'm always on guard. So there was quite a tranche of feedback which appears to be in response to women's safety particularly, but there's some intersectionality there around being an ethnic woman or an older ethnic woman or an older woman, for example. So there's lots of things to unpack there, and hopefully we'll do that over the course of over the next few weeks and months. As we move on to the next slide, we prompted people on the one after this, Dawn, apologies. When we prompted people on what local or national changes would help people feel safer, a significant number of respondents to the survey referenced a range of services or I would say infrastructure improvements. So it was interesting that Derek earlier on mentioned lighting. That came across quite a lot actually in the survey responses. I think in a response to women's safety, as I mentioned, but also because I think we had a few folk from the blind or visually impaired community who were quite big on that issue. So lots of themes noted in the report around improved and more street lighting, CCTV in park areas, that kind of stuff. There was lots of commentary from visually impaired people around pavement clutter, and that being a particular concern from them as we move out of lockdown, and the desire by entertainment industries, pubs, clubs, cafes to have more street furniture, and that being a problem for that particular cohort of people we spoke to. One issue that I'd never considered before in my life, but came across from that particular focus group, was around charging electronic vehicles and how cables are now being trailed from houses onto across pavements and onto the road for cars. So again, there's some new things emerging there that affects a particular cohort's safety in our community, and we need to at least be aware of that and maybe drawing some conclusions from it. I think more generally, more specifically, that there are themes in the report around things that affect people with protected characteristics. So on that slide, you can see there's stuff around raising awareness of disabilities, having people from LGBT communities involved in the design of public services more, and raising awareness of the particular issues around homophobia or transphobia. Lots of comments in the survey around challenging toxic masculinity and misogyny. Again, I think perhaps influenced by the events in London and Sarah Everard's death, that was happening as we did the survey in that first week of March, second week of March. And then a few comments there at the end around being a woman and feeling safe on trains and having better deterrent messages, as part of that exercise. One additional comment I would draw attention to is the one on the left-hand side of that slide around gypsy travellers. So there was a few comments made in the survey around that, and that was made before there was some very recent controversy about politicians' attitudes to gypsy travellers. So I wonder whether if we ran this again, that might become a bigger issue. But just being aware of safety requirements of that particular community within geographic communities as being something I think worthy of further exploration. And I know that Lorraine is keen that we do run more sessions with those groups as soon as we possibly can. We'll move on to the next slide, Dawn, if you don't mind, and I'll just reference the fact that we've now run, in addition to those surveys, we've run some focus groups or one-to-one sessions with 4 groups. So I've mentioned the blind and visually impaired people. There's people from various LGBTQI communities, and we've run stuff with some children and young people, and then latterly with victims and witnesses to crime. Now, I've summarised that. I've pulled out some comments or some quotes from each of those sessions, which you can see on this slide and the subsequent one. And I think almost by definition that there are different agendas and concerns from those groups. But what is interesting, and we'll do more work on this, is there is some sort of commonality around. One theme that came across from all 4 was concerns about people, groups of people drinking in public areas. All of them referenced that unprompted. A few of the groups, certainly 3 of them, mentioned public transport in a way that wasn't referenced in the survey or the previous focus groups we did, and a real concern about the safety of public transport in Scotland. A particular concern for children and young people, a particular concern for people from the LGBTQI community. So some thoughts there about maybe worthy of more exploration by colleagues in the network and beyond. So some stuff there I think to look at around street lighting, social infrastructure or physical infrastructure in communities, antisocial behaviour or group alcohol use, and public transport emerging as common themes. But then there are individual themes for those groups that the network and others will have to focus on. Anyway, as I said, the SESN intends to follow up with other organisations that expressed an interest in participating in this exercise, but for whom capacity or timing just didn't allow involvement at this stage. So we want to do more with older people, and we want to do something with folk from minority ethnic backgrounds, and definitely some conversations with groups representing Gypsy, Traveller and Roma communities in Scotland. And I know that Lorraine, Josh, Dawn and others have made contacts, have elicited some sort of support for doing that in due course. And the intention would be that SESN uses the approach that we've done for these other workshops for these other groups as well in due course. So I think just to recap, this is a live exercise. There's more work to be done. There are some common themes emerging from the groups that we have spoken to, but then some very specific concerns that those groups that we'll have to explore as a cohort of interested partners in due course. And that's me. I'm now I'm exhausted.
David, there's been loads of comments in the chat box. We've got a few minutes to pick up some of those, and then I can maybe talk about what some of our next steps are. Before I forget, though, I just wanted to say that we've been working with Senate Media to produce a fairly simple but we think effective animation that will make available to all of our community safety partners very soon, just highlighting those perceptions stuff. Right. So we just wanted to make something that could be very easy to use and that you can use in a variety of situations. So that's coming fairly soon. Lots and lots of comments. Does anyone want to come in and specifically talk about them or ask David and Margaret anything before we finish up? We've got about 10 minutes. I'm not seeing. Oh, hang on. Karen.
Hi, I just thought I'd mention the kind of, there's annual citizen surveys. I don't know if that's specific to each local authority area. I think it is. And it just struck me that when you said that there was more work to be done, it's maybe worth just even seeing what the results of these surveys are. The Scottish Household Survey, thank you Margaret, who named that, is the national version, and they have questions in it like, how safe do you feel in your local area when walking at night? And sometimes we often question the value of that, because one of them is actually in our city plan, and we've had numerous debates about that, because how do you define that? However, I just thought it's worth just correlating what your work against what's coming out there. Okay.
Yep. Karen, I think that's a fantastic point. I mean, we do, as routine, when the Scottish Household Survey results come out, we will do a trawl of it and we'll send out what we think is relevant to community safety. So it's something that we've done for a few years. But the issue that you made about perception, I too have been part of a community safety partnership and have that debate. And I think not paying attention to what people perceive is folly. I think if people don't feel safe, then that is likely to have an impact on what they do and how they feel, and then that is likely to have an impact on the resources and services that will need to be put in to make them feel safer. So I understand all the arguments about it. I've had them myself hundreds of times. but I think when we think it is really important to pay attention to how people feel and whether they feel safe or not. So it's a bit of a rant from me, sorry. Pauline, do you want to come? Well, Pauline, do you want to come back in, and then Billy again?
Yeah, thanks. It's related to the household survey discussion we were just having. It's possible, because all local authorities, as far as I understand it, do a localised version of the national study. And in Glasgow, we've managed to get every second year we get a set of questions about hate crime specific questions. But I wonder if there's a possibility of linking the work that you're doing with your focus groups and your the stuff that's more discursive, and maybe working with COSLA or targeting individual local authorities and seeing if there are opportunities there to join up the work and maybe be asking a common set of questions that gives kind of richer data. Just a suggestion.
And a good suggestion.
Yeah.
Yep. Come back to you on that. Billy, do you want to come in?
Yes, I would like to come in, thank you. I was just wondering, I'm quite taken by the last slide you did with the vulnerable children and young people and talking about that. And I see the first thing that you had on there was I feel safe when I don't need to be alert all the time. And I assume, is that linked in with ACEs and that kind of agenda at the moment? And has there been any looking at how that links in?
All I can say is that the kids that we spoke to as part of that particular group were kids from pretty vulnerable backgrounds who may have experienced, you know, adverse situations in their upbringing. So I think that was the cohort that we spoke to. As it links in with that agenda, not that I'm aware of at the moment, but I think something that the network and colleagues should be looking at. Definitely, yeah, it's definitely there. And I know that other colleagues from SCSN were very keen. In fact, it is reflected somewhere in the systems map we referenced earlier on around trauma-informed, you know, policy and those kind of things. So there are links, I think, back to that wider agenda, Billy, but maybe not specifically.
No, that's brilliant. Thank you.
Yeah, Billy, we are particularly interested in trauma-informed practice and what we know about ACEs and how that fits with how we respond to and deal with antisocial behaviour. So there's a piece of work that we're involved in, and we're talking to the Scottish Government at the moment, just really questioning, why we take the same approach to antisocial behaviour that we have for such a long time when we know so much more now, and there is a different approach we could take that is more pro-social. So again, watch this space for that, and come back to us if you want to have some further chat on it.
Yeah, cool. That's brilliant. Thank you.
Susan, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, just to say that Edinburgh's just changed their ASB policy, and it's actually very much person-centred. It's very much putting in support. It's working in partnership. It's looking at who's the best person to go in and engage with that family. It's looking at ACEs. It's all trauma-based, because what's happened to that family, nobody wants to be antisocial. It can be addictions, it could be mental health. So we've actually just revamped our whole policy that's just literally just been signed off by councillors and elected members. I think it was just last week, but it's been a long time coming. We're now called Family and Household Support, previously Community Safety Officers. We're now all support workers or team leaders, managers within the Family and Household Support Service. And I think it is definitely the way forward. Coming from an enforcement background, and now I've always recognised enforcement's not the answer. It's necessary in some cases, but it's not the answer. It's positive engagement and collaborating with other partners to get the best outcome for our people.
Susan, can we see that and can we share it, please? I think there's lots of people who would be interested in seeing that.
And seeing the policy?
Yes, please.
Will I send it to yourself? I'm not sure, put your email up on the...
Yeah, send it to me and we'll maybe get in touch with you and have a chat with you about what it took to get that place. What did you have to do to get
4 years.
Right. So you might have, we worked with your colleague Shirley on producing a case study around the partnership activity in the Meadows, and we put that out. We're really keen on working with really good things that are happening and sharing them. So we might come to you and do a case study or something like that, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Grand. We're almost at the end. Anyone have any burning things that they haven't managed to say or ask David or Margaret before we wrap up? Okay, I'm not seeing anything. So we've kept remarkably to time. Well done.
It's a good chair, Lorraine. That's what it is.
So I just want to say thank you everyone for coming. We all are so passionate about keeping communities safer, and I love being part of that community. And thank you. There's a few things that I will take away. So I did say that we've got a new staff member coming. We'll need them because there's clearly a lot of work for us to do. The kind of the main things for me is that we are really keen to work up some case studies. So if you have something that is interesting and you want us to do some more work on, please get in touch. We'll do that. We're doing another version of the very same piece next week. But if you want one of the team to come and talk to your CSP about any of the aspects of the research, we're very happy to do that. And we're very happy to come and have a chat with your community safety partnership about some of its post-COVID strategies or some of the ASB strategies. It kind of feels to me that there's a lot of work to do around digital safety, a lot of work to do around data and evidence. And I've been in this game for a long time, and we have been talking a lot about data and evidence, and it would be really great to get some movement on that. We will think about how we support more better information sharing, the analytical capacity of CSPs. We will come back to that at some point, and we will think about GDPR. We did put something out a while back around some suggestions for CSPs around GDPR, but we'll go back to that and review that again. Data sharing protocols, again, people are really keen that we take a look at that, and so we will. I think that's enough. So you've given us some work to do for a bit. That's great, and we will come back to all of you guys as we kind of progress that. So just for me to say thank you to David and Margaret, and thank you to all of you for coming along and keep in touch. Cheers.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye.